Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
It's Laura in the studio.
Hello, it's Paddy in the studio.
And it's Henry at home.
And this morning, we talked a lot about the NHS. So yesterday, you were talking about a film.
Everything Everywhere All at Once.
And why were you talking about that film?
Because there's a feeling by those in the know that the world order is changing and that conflicts from North Korea through Russia and the Middle East and into Africa are linked in some way.
So everything is happening around the world, everywhere, all at once.
And we discussed that with a very well-known former White House advisor who said the world order is changing and it's all linked to a weak United States and weak international institutions.
Well, here's a funny thing, because that phrase, everything, everywhere, all at once, came out of the mouth of none other than the Health Secretary this morning.
There isn't a single part of government that can't in some way link to the growth agenda.
Do you agree?
But we can't fund everything everywhere all at once. So you've got to bear with us here because...
I hadn't even told him before that that's what you were doing on Broadcasting House. And I hadn't teed him up, I promised. And he can't have been heard at the beginning of your programme because he was sitting in my studio when it went on.
It's meta. We call that meta, don't we? That's what we call it.
So meta.
It doesn't mean anything, but it's the word that gets you from one place to another. So here we're going to move on with the news on Sunday's episode of Newscast.
And we should say, before we get cracking, that Wes Streeting is in charge of the NHS in England. In Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, it is run by other people. But when they make decisions about funding, if the NHS gets more funding, then parts of the rest of the UK also do get more funding. Anyway, we've got that out of the way. It's an issue close to my heart. When Wes Streeting is talking about the NHS, he means the NHS in England. Actually,
just to say, that's a really important piece of information that I don't think I knew, that the decision taken by the Secretary of State in Westminster, under the formulae...
The Barnett consequentials.
...automatically goes to the nations.
We could do a whole podcast about the Barnett consequentials.
There's no demand for it.
That's a very big relief, because I'm now thinking, oh God, did I get that slightly wrong? Have I made it more simple than it really is in truth?
Henry, do you think voters around the land know that Laura geek point?
No, I don't. And I think it's a source of frustration.
Is it right?
What, the point specifically about how the Barnett consequentials work? Well, I don't know. But I do think it's a source of frustration for governments in Westminster that they are in this sort of Devo Max world blamed for things that they would say they don't have particular control over. And you heard, in every debate about health in the run up to the last election, you heard the then Conservative government saying, but in Labour run Wales. And I, to be honest, think that point sailed over quite a lot of people's heads, even though they were very keen to make it, because fundamentally, and this is why it's such a hot button issue and why we're talking about it today. People experience health as personal stories, as care of their family members and so on, rather than as a sort of abstract accountability thing to do with different politicians in different parliaments across the land.
And we expect the NHS to get more money linked to reform in the budget.
We do, very much so. We'll talk about that in a sec, but I should just clarify, because I have just checked. Actually, health, because it's devolved, if the UK government increases its total spending in England, the block grant would increase for Scotland, but actually the Scottish government in Edinburgh could then spend it on whatever they wanted. So theoretically, the NHS in Scotland could get more money, but it's then up to Holyrood. So there we are. I wish I'd never mentioned it in the first place.
No, I think it's very good you did.
So yes, Wes Streeting is out there. He's starting a big public consultation tomorrow, asking the public what they want to change in the NHS over the next 10 years. He is talking a lot about technology and whether people, if they have given smartwatches to help monitor their heart rate or monitor their health, how technology could be used in the NHS. All of these things that I think many newscasters would agree probably sound like a good idea to try to bring the NHS up to scratch, particularly in parts of the country or parts of different specialities where it's been dragging behind. The reality, though, is, as lots of newscasters will tell us on a regular basis, is that there are things that are immediately going very wrong in some places right now. And I think that's really a huge challenge for him, is how does he marry up these ideas of ambitious long-term reforms with grappling with very significant problems in the here and now?
One of the things that is often said to me, particularly by people in your profession, is how are you going to reform this NHS when you've got all these staff against you? It's the total opposite. Staff on the front line are crying out for change and they're coming up with ideas. They are also angry about waste and inefficiency and the dead hand of bureaucracy in the system. And I think I've got a much better chance of succeeding if this is a team effort and if I mobilise more than 1 million people who work in the NHS to do this with me rather than me doing it to the NHS.
Henry, what did you make of how Streeting was this morning? Because I felt he was sort of really kind of battling away, just saying they were going to stick to the promises that they'd made in the manifesto or the immediate things that they were going to do, but he was reluctant to put dates on when he'll be able to hit any of the things that they said or keep any of the promises that they made. And I think it was the kind of interview we think, wow, these new ministers really are now into how hard their jobs are going to be.
Totally right. And especially in the final days in the run up to a budget, which will take place on Wednesday week. Wes Streeting knows by now what settlement he's secured from Rachel Reeves and Darren Jones, her Chief Secretary to the Treasury, but he can't tell us. And so I think that's a sort of slight element to why perhaps he was a little more reluctant than usual to give you specific answers on timeframes and money and so on. But I also think there is a tension that was running throughout your exchanges with him today, and to be honest, I think is running throughout exchanges with almost every government minister at the moment, which is that they are very good at the moment at talking about the long term, fixing the foundations. That's the mantra of this government, and that's going to be at least part of the title of this budget. So they're very good about saying in the long term they're going to reform things, they're going to grasp nettles that previous governments haven't, enter sticking plaster politics, as Keir Starmer used to call it. But what I think, and ministers know this, they are less good at doing is being able to say to the voting public, these things have changed or are changing immediately in your lives as a consequence of Labour being in government rather than the Conservatives since July. And I think that is a challenge for them. I guess in Wes Streeting's case, he'd talk about settling the junior doctor strike, but he only talks about that as a precondition for longer lasting reform being possible rather than as a precondition for things immediately getting better. And I think, when it comes to health, this government's going to be judged at the next general election on the state of waiting lists, on how people experience A&E. A 10-year programme for reform is something that, as you say, I'm sure every newscaster would agree is a good thing for the government to be doing. But it is way down the track for anyone to be able to judge it. And that is a risk, I think, politically for this government.
I think that's right. And also the idea that they settled the junior doctor strikes does not preclude the idea, the idea that they settled the junior doctor strike, obviously they believe is a big achievement, but GPs are taking some collective action. Pharmacists are wondering about whether they should go on strike. The Royal College of Nurses rejected the pay award. So to cite the junior doctors strike being settled all the time does not mean that actually everything is hunky-dory between the government and the NHS workforce. And it was interesting to me that he was very reluctant to give timescales about any of the immediate promises that we got used to hearing in the election campaign. 40,000 extra appointments every week in the NHS, 700,000 more dental appointments, which he used to say was immediate and urgent. We checked that out with the British Dental Association. They said there's been absolutely zero progress on that. Now, yes, they are barely 4 months in, but 4 months will very quickly become 6 months, will very quickly become 9 months, will very quickly become 12 months. And you can see there was a point in the interview, he's like, look, we can't have done everything, or, that's when he said we can't do everything everywhere all at once, all at the same time. But that kind of proof point, how do they prove that they are actually making progress? And I think, as Henry says, that is a vulnerability for them.
Can you tell us a few policy things? I'm looking at the neighbourhood health service, possible cross-party on social care. And we've all interviewed Wes Streeting a lot. Could you tell anything? So on the policy, can we do some policy? But also, could you tell anything from his mood, his demeanour, given that Henry says, this is a man looking at you knowing, I would speculate, my name's Wes Streeting. I know I've got 10 billion more. Let's just give it a number. Do you think, did he look like a man who knows he's going to have an easier message after the budget?
I think so. And also, he is close to Rachel Reeves, and he mentioned Rachel Reeves about 1,000 times in our interview. He kept sort of praising the Chancellor.
Which he would not do if he was going to have to say it's all awful being cut.
Possibly. And he probably wouldn't do if he'd had a massive bust-up with her behind closed doors and actually he felt that the Department of Health was getting shortchanged. So it was interesting. saying that he was, seeking to praise her again and again. But remember also, last week we were talking about the sort of inner ring of cabinet ministers and the outer ring of cabinet ministers. Wes Streeting is absolutely right there in the middle with Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. He is absolutely a core part of the project. So, and very aligned with what overall they're trying to do. I don't doubt that behind the scenes he fights very hard for the Department of Health to get a big chunk of the pie, but he's politically absolutely aligned with Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. So I think, he knows he's got a better time than a lot of his colleagues, put it that way.
Henry,
but I think he also feels that massive pressure because the health service is what Labour will be judged on. They know that.
Well, and I was speaking to someone near the top of this government who knows health policy inside out earlier this week, and they were saying, look, even a big increase for health, which they're saying, something that the previous government wouldn't have been able to deliver and wouldn't have contemplated, even a big increase in that budget for spending for the NHS is not going to feel like a big increase as patients experience it, because they said, look, the context for that is, well, firstly, pay settlements with NHS staff absorb some of that money. And then you're still looking at a situation where hospitals are failing. That's the language that this person I was speaking to used. And, waiting lists are really high. So it's still sort of a question of, running really fast to kind of stand still. Not quite. I mean, I don't think that's quite how the government would like to look at it. But, this is why the £22 billion black hole went to 40 billion this week, as Rachel Reeves said to Cabinet on Tuesday. She said, look, if we fill the black hole, that is a recipe for things staying as they are. But we need even more money just for things to become more adequate. I think, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, and remember, the NHS has had absolutely pots and pots and pots and pots and pots more money every year, and productivity has gone down and things have got worse. So the government... Post-pandemic, yeah. But that, and demand has gone up and the population's getting more elderly. But, it is true that money isn't the only answer. But in terms of money, I think more broadly, and the whole political dilemma for this government when it comes to the budget is it might feel quite brutal. It might be quite brutal in some places. And how on earth are they going to sell that to voters with a smile on their face and say, hey, this is a government that you can feel good about, when essentially they're serving up something that's going to be quite unpalatable in lots of ways. You mentioned their social care, Paddy. It's almost like become a sort of tradition with Wes Streeting. Every time he comes on the programme, we say, where's your plan for social care? And I don't mean what they've already done, which is make some changes to carers' pay, which are significant and have happened. And that is, part of the plan. But the big reform to social care, it's been promised and promised and promised and promised. They dropped the previous government's budget cap, the care budget cap that they were going to do, even though they promised to keep it in the election. So they've broken that promise and dropped it. And there is no sign of Labour's big social care reform. Now, Wes Streeting sort of got round that this morning by saying, I'm very encouraged because everybody says that they want to work with me on it. But to be explicit about it, there is a zero sign of progress on a decision about what to do about this and if and when they are going to have what was discussed previously in the run-up to the election, whether it is a cross-party commission or a commission led by a smart person to come up with a plan. And the delay on this, he admitted that you can't sort out the NHS if you don't sort out social care. But it's almost like, it's not there. So
one of the unmentionables, and this has been the case for Conservative...
Yes, it's on our unsayables list, isn't it? Yeah.
And another one is sometimes patients are rubbish. Some patients don't show up to appointments. In some countries, you get issued with a bill if you do that.
Yeah.
Also, people are not looking after themselves. Preventative measures on health do not just belong to Nanny Wes. They belong to me. I have a responsibility in a socialised system. And one of the things that brings it into very sharp relief is the use of the drug Ozempic, because there's an argument developing among Radio 4 listeners, which is, I've cut my weight by lifestyle, I changed my diet, I went to the gym, I go walking, I've cut my weight down, versus this drug which will bring your weight down. Did you go into Ozempic?
Yes, we certainly did, because the government is trialling a weight loss jab and a pilot to see if you can give it to people who are obese to help them get back to work. So there's a study on that the government is looking at. And also there is a separate question of whether NICE, who the medical regulators, allow another drug to start being used, and therefore there's an interesting conversation about who should get it. So it's very current. People have very strong views on it, and this is what Wes Streeting had to say.
They're not the only solution, and I don't want to create a dependency culture. I also, by the way, should say, because there's been a lot of reaction to some of the things I've said this week, I'm also not interested in some dystopian future where I wander around kind of involuntarily jabbing unemployed people who are overweight. That is not the agenda.
So we've had a message from Anna, who's one of your viewers. I'm a resident doctor in the NHS. The incidence of type 2 diabetes in children and young people is on the rise. Now, I think that's a lifestyle-linked version of diabetes. Currently, we're struggling to be able to prescribe weight loss jabs for these patients because we've been advised that there's a national shortage.
So that's interesting. How do you expand it if there already isn't enough? We had another message from Jenny. She said the government should make the supermarkets pay for the obesity problem. Obesity is down to the problem of people becoming addicted to processed foods. And we had Zan van Tulleken, the TV doctor, on the programme this morning. He is as passionate as you can possibly believe about this being a food problem. And this is about regulating food companies, doing things differently, taking some quite bold action. He completely rejects the idea that it would be nanny state, but he's absolutely clear that the answer actually is about how we eat. It's not about introducing more pharmacological, is that the right word? Do I mean that? Pharmacological?
Well, it's a drug-related response.
Yeah, a drug-related response, or a more kind of medicalisation of various things. A big action on the food industry is what he thinks is the answer.
I mean, the sense I get from speaking to people in government about this week, including, I asked Keir Starmer about it when I interviewed him on Tuesday in Downing Street, is that they are just sort of the optimistic phase. So it's not that this is the sort of grand plan where they've gone, aha, this is going to solve the riddle of economic inactivity. But there is genuine optimism, I think, in government about how fast the tech on this might move. But clearly you then plunge straight into a sort of broader, almost like moral debate. I think that's what a lot of this is about, whose responsibility it is for people to live healthy lifestyles, and at what point government intervention is legitimate or not. But the thing that they're very eager to caution in government is that the way they see this, and it's way down the track, but the way they see this is not sort of, someone going to the job centre, not having a job because they might have obesity-related health conditions and then being referred on for a weight loss jab. I think it's more that weight loss jabs would be prescribed by the NHS for clinical reasons, and they hope that as a consequence, but more a sort of byproduct than the sort of main reason, those people would then be more likely to be more productive in the workforce.
I think it does, though, lead us, as you say, into a really interesting moral and political conversation. And in politics, conversations about morality don't always sort of end very well, right? But there's a story the BBC was running yesterday where there are thousands of women who've been told in England that they can't have a cancer drug which might extend their lives. It's prescribed currently in Scotland and not in lots of other European countries, but not in England. And to govern is to choose. There's never going to be as much as to possibly meet the demand for the health service. Everybody sort of knows that. So it's always about where do you make these decisions? Yeah. Where do you make these calls? And if many people listening, you've been saying on Radio 4, listeners, a lot of people are starting to say, well, hang on a minute, this is something that you as an individual can take responsibility for. Well,
here's a good example in children's toothbrushing. So Wes has been in the past, Wes Streeting has been on my programme and yours in the past saying he's in favour of giving lessons in schools.
And they are going to do that.
They are going to do that. But of course, a lot of our listeners would say, well, where are the parents? Where are the parents? And that is a very useful political fault line. That's not so much about morals. That's something where if I'm a politician with the right stripe, I can say this shows us a crisis in parenting, not a crisis in schools. So, Henry, what are the Conservatives doing? Will they try and triangulate Labour as a bunch of old nannies, given that they were funding the NHS up until July the 4th?
Well, look, at the moment, the Conservatives aren't doing an awful lot on anything other than having a debate among themselves. But that's the truth. I mean, the shadow cabinet, such as it is not in a position to lay out sort of clear lines of attack that will last for years. But finally, we are a week away from knowing. Is it a week?
2
Or
weeks.
is it 2 weeks?
November
Sorry,
the
2
2nd.
weeks. So I was getting ahead of myself because I was so
You're
excited
so
for this leadership
excited.
election to finally come to an end. We are 2 weeks away from knowing whether Kemi Badenoch or Robert Jenrick is going to lead the Conservative Party. My hunch would be that either of them, but especially if Kemi Badenoch were to win, would pursue a sort of anti-nanny state, for want of a better phrase, approach on this. I mean, Robert Jenrick, of course, has admitted that he
Took his
dabbled
Ozempic.
with Ozempic. He said he didn't like it very much.
I didn't inhale.
Well, it's the sort. It's the sort of that. Well, the thing. Yeah, except his dalliance with Ozempic. It certainly coincided with a makeover, which certainly coincided with advanced preparations for his leadership bid.
And it may be a fault line, actually, as we go forward, sort of accusations of nanny statism, whoever wins the Tory contest. And this is maybe a little preview of that from Kevin Hollingrake, one of the last shadow ministers standing, who was good enough to give us his time this morning.
Well, we welcome the reforms. The public sector needs to be more productive. It needs to be more efficient. And so we'll support the Labour government where we can. We want it to succeed. I am concerned about some of the talk around the financial difficulties they have based upon this £22 billion myth of a black hole. But nevertheless, that aside, I think where we can support, whereas we can. We will. I think it's slightly worrying when we talk about some of the nanny state measures, like giving people Ozempic jabs and things. We need to look at those proposals in detail when they come forward.
I'm from the voter school that quite likes to know relevant information to do with health. For instance, Wes Streeting, our Secretary of State for Health, with the previous devolution explanation already given, is a cancer survivor.
Indeed he is.
I think that's important information, and I think many people around the NHS, knowing he's taking decisions on cancer spending, would find that to be a piece of important information.
I think that's right, because actually politicians, part of their job is to relate, to emote, to be understanding of people's situations and the people that they're making decisions about. And I think that is something that he absolutely has been very open about. And I'm not suggesting for cynical reasons. I'm suggesting because it is an important part of his makeup as a human being and therefore as a politician too.
The point I was going to make is I don't think it does Robert Jenrick any harm to have told the public he's done Ozempic. It's no point him nuancing it by saying I didn't really like it. But it's fine. It's relevant at the moment. It's a relevant piece of information. Anyway, Henry, what we're really saying is health has remained, during my entire lifetime, the big way to judge the governments of the United Kingdom. We've just had this massive majority delivered to Labour, and guess what? They're going to be defined by what they do with the NHS.
And particularly for Labour governments, I think, because they are always keen to remind everybody, as Wes Streeting did this morning, that they are the party that created the NHS. The Conservatives, he reminded everybody, voted against the creation of the NHS 22 times. Is thinking there's a fun pub quiz fact, Mr. Streeting. But particularly for a Labour Party, they know the pressure is massively on them when it comes to the NHS. But one of the things that Wes Streeting definitely really believes is part of the solution is the advancement of technology and the advancement of using artificial intelligence to do all sorts of whizzy things to cut some of the problems, cut some of the bureaucracy, have people who can do things quicker and really make the most of that technology. But lots of people are worried about what that might mean. What does that mean for our own data? What does that mean for our privacy? What does that mean for all the things that we trust the NHS for? Suddenly, if much more is done by technology, much more is done by machine, where is the risk in that? And there was quite a fiery exchange on our programme this morning about it with Baroness Shami Chakrabarti for Labour, Mark Warner, who's the boss of Faculty AI, which is an AI company, and also Zan van Tilliken, the TV doctor, is a flavour of it.
It sets our civilization back hundreds of years. We no longer live in a democracy. We no longer have rights and
freedoms. It's the Terminator movies. It's all shorthand for Skynet Terminator movies, isn't it? That's the worst outcome is something like that, isn't it?
We need legislation.
We need
primary legislation, as they now have in Europe. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but in the end, there will have to be treaties around this because it's going to be very difficult to do this one nation or even one group of nations. But we have to play catch up fast because, as Mark says, this is, the tech bros that you describe have already got ahead of this. They've colonised the internet, let alone this new technology of advanced intelligence.
I think it's important to be pragmatic. There are AI technologies that have been used for decades that are totally safe And by embracing those effectively, we'll help diagnose cancer earlier, we'll help nurses do their paperwork more effectively. We can't get too extreme and lose the opportunities that those technologies progress.
Now, that was Mark Warner, the boss of an AI company, Faculty AI, which is working a lot with the public sector. And clearly for them, it's a business opportunity. But where we came into that clip was them talking about the sort of the worst risks of AI sort of running off with it, and some of those sort of apocalyptic warning that we have heard from people who really are experts in this field.
Listening to that debate, I just thought what was so fascinating about it is that's a debate that is going to dominate increasingly, I think, politics, but actually our lives. And I'm not sure it's certainly a debate that increasingly people in Westminster are having.
Yeah.
But I think that was a sort of articulate debate because you had three people with interests in the topic.
With that thought, we say thank you very much for listening to us.
That's more than enough from us today on this Sunday's newscast. We'll be back next weekend and Adam will be here tomorrow. But thanks for watching.
Newscast from the BBC.